is this translation table, which is quite useful. So quite often you may be wanting to set your power, and you may know that power in milliwatts but not know what the dBMs are. Now personally, when I do a site survey, I always carry a calculator so I can calculate the settings. But in this case, Cisco's actually provided that, and so let's click on that and take a look at that translation table. So say, for instance, I wanted to transmit at 20 milliwatts, then you can see here that the dBm would be 13. So I would have to key in 13 or lower in order to make sure I was beneath the 20 milliwatt threshold. So in this example, I'm going to set it at 25 milliwatts, which is 14 dBm. So I'm going to close that. And here I'm going to select 14. Now this setting here, the client power, is the maximum power that the client can transmit at. And so this is broadcasted on the beacon, and anyone trying to connect to that access point would have to transmit at that maximum power level. And so to balance both the transmission power level of the access point with the transmission power level of the client, I may also want to set the client power. But this isn't a deployment scenario. In this scenario, we are just using this as a site survey. And so I'm just going to change the transmit power, but I'm not going to have any clients transmitting. So I'm just going to reset that up to the maximum so it doesn't show on the CLI interface a little bit later on. And then I'm going to come down here and select Apply. So those settings have now been saved, and now what I want to do is go and do the same thing for my 5 GHz radio. So I'll come over here and click this, and again click Settings. And you can see again that the radio has been enabled and has been set up as an access point, so a point to multi-point deployment. Again, I could have set this up as a bridge, or I could have set the 2.4 GHz as an access point and then the 5 GHz as a bridge if I was doing a mesh deployment. So it's really a matter of what kind of site deployment I'm doing as to how I would do those settings. Now if we come down here again, you're seeing the modulation and coding schemes, and come down a little bit further and you'll see the power settings. And again, I've got my translation table here if I need to, but in this case I'm going to set the transmit power to 8. I'll leave this as a maximum so we don't see it on the CLI. Down here, this one here enables me to set the frequency channel. In the case of the 2.4 GHz radio, I left it as a default. In this case, I'm actually going to change it because this is set to dynamic frequency selection and I want it to use a specific channel. So I'm going to set it to channel 36. And then if you come down here, I can also define the channel width. And I'm going to leave it for the site survey as a 20 megahertz channel. But if I was deploying it and I wanted to deploy it as an 802.11n using a 40 megahertz channel, then I would define the primary to be this one up here, in this case channel 36, and then I can define the secondary channel as above or below the primary channel. In this case, we're not going to do that. The world mode, multi-domain operations, and the country code, these are only applicable to your legacy access points, and so it's not applicable to an 802.11n radio. Down here you can see my antennas here. You would always leave on diversity, but there might be some situations where you don't want to deploy a full MIMO, and you can see here that I have an option to set the left, the center, or the right access points. And you can see here I have an option to set the left or the center or the right antennas. So let's say, for instance, you are doing a deployment and you just wanted to use one antenna, you didn't want to use MIMO, and you wanted to connect that, let's say, to the left antenna. You would come along here and you would click these boxes here. But if you're using MIMO, then you would leave it with diversity. Now this access point uses internal antennas, and again, if I was to use external antennas, I could disable this and then add the antenna gain. And remember that my maximum power level that I set up here, plus my antenna gain, minus any cable losses, must be at or below my legal ERP levels. So always must check to make sure your transmit power and your antenna gain do not break the legal regulations. So we're going to come down and click Apply. So we've now saved those settings, and I'm going to come out now from my browser interface. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to change the transmit power but using the CLI interface. So let's click on this tool here. In this example I'm actually using PuTTY, but there's several different tools you can use. In here I've actually saved the settings to connect to the Cisco access point, so I'm going to load those. And you can see that I'm connecting with a serial line interface, and my speed here is just 9600. So I hit OK, and this brings up my PuTTY window. I hit the return key to bring up the command prompt. Now the first thing I need to do is to go into the exec privilege mode, and to do that I type enable, and it's asking me for the password just like it did when I came in through the web interface. So I type the default as Cisco. Notice now the command prompt has changed to a pound key, indicating that I'm in the exec privilege mode. First thing I like to do is take a look at my configuration. So I do show config. And you can see here's my first radio, radio 0. And you can see here that the power level is how we set it at power level 14. And notice here's my channel setting. So I can make sure it's the 2.4 gigahertz radio. I come down a bit. And now you can see radio 1. And you can see here, this is my 5 gigahertz radio. And here you can see the local power setting that we did, and we're going to change those. So I hit Command C to come out of the show config, back to my command prompt. Now to change the settings, I need to go into the configuration terminal mode. So I type in config term. Notice here again my command prompt has changed to indicate that I'm in a different mode. And the first thing I need to do is change that power setting. And to do that, I need to go into the radio interface. We'll do the 2.4 gigahertz radio first. And then I'm going to change the power setting. So it's power local. Now if I can't remember what the settings are, I can simply put a question mark in here. And now you can see the power levels that I can choose. And so in this illustration, I'm going to change it from 14 to 17. The return. So now I want to do the same thing for my 5 gigahertz radio. So I need to go into the other radio interface. Radio 1. Notice here that my power settings are different. Whereas before I was able to go all the way up to 20 dBm, here I can only go up to 17 dBm. And the reason is that I'm in a different regulatory domain. I mean, this is the 5 gigahertz, which is regulated differently than the 2.4. So in this example, I think I'll change it from 8 to 11. Hit return, hit exit, end. Now, I always like to save my configuration. So I'm just going to say copy, running config, to the startup config, Now let's take a look at our configuration and see if that worked. So there you can see radio 0, and just like we set it to the power local of 17. Come down a little bit more, and you'll see here radio 1, my 5 gigahertz radio, and you can see the power local of 11, just like we set it. Now, just as an FYI, if you set the power level to the maximum, then this command won't show, because if it's set to the maximum, it's set to the default value, and so it just won't show here at all. So what I've shown you here is that I can change my transmit power level either through the browser interface or the command line interface. The choice is yours as to which one you use. A lot of people like the browser interface because they say it's a little bit more user friendly. I personally prefer the CLI, and what you've seen in the CLI is that for doing the survey, I have a relatively simple configuration, and I like the CLI is because I can do the show config and see the entire configuration. So if someone's borrowed my access point to do a survey and change the settings, I can see immediately by going into the CLI interface, and then I can change it. It's a little bit more difficult to see those changes by going through the browser interface, so I personally prefer the CLI. So let's go through a couple of terms that you should walk away from here. Firstly, the ERP, this is the measurement of the power that's actually radiated from an antenna, and this is generally part of the regulations for both the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz band, and so you should be aware of that, and particularly if you're using an external antenna. The FCC, this is the Federal Communications Commission here in the United States that regulates the spectrum. OSHA, this is in the US again, an example of the type of regulation that you're going to see that you need to be aware of before you go out on site and start doing a site survey, and make sure that you're conforming to any national, local, or industry-specific codes. Part 15, I threw this one in here, we didn't talk about it, but this is if you want to look up the FCC regulation for transmitting in the 2.4 or the 5 gigahertz band, this is the document that you should look for. The last thing I wanted to remind you that Cisco used specific antenna connections to connect the antenna to your access point. These are called the RPTNC, and this prevents you from connecting any antenna to the access point and accidentally exceeding the maximum ERP levels. In this lesson, we talked about spectrum regulation, and we went through all of the different terms, and then I used the US regulation as an example for how unlicensed spectrum is actually regulated. We then took a look at the safety regulations, and it's really important to remember that there are codes that you have to conform to. And again, I took you through some of the examples of the codes that you'll see here in the United States, but you'll see codes in all of the countries around the world about how you have to behave when you're on that site. We then took a look at equipment ratings and talked about the enclosures that you might need to put your access point in if you're operating in a hostile environment. And we just finished up going through a demonstration showing you how you can configure the transmit power on a Cisco access point, and I took you through 2 different ways that you can do that.